Final Fantasy Origin, Strangers of Paradise is really good, actually. Final Fantasy is one of the longest running JRPG series on the modern gaming market. With over 16 mainline entries, plus a whole host of sequels, spin-offs, remakes, crossovers, and extended media, it's fair to say most people have some exposure to Final Fantasy. I know I was familiar with creatures like the Chocobo, Cactuar, and Tonberry before I had any full exposure to a mainline title. I don't think it was until Cloud was added to Super Smash Bros. That I finally took the time to seek out and play Final Fantasy VII. From there, I was totally enamored, ready to dive into the games at large, picking up the 10 and 10-2 remaster, Final Fantasy VII Remake, Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XVI, and Final Fantasy Origin, Strangers of Paradise. Everyone has a favorite Final Fantasy game. Maybe it's nostalgia, maybe it's the characters and the story, or a unique twist to the gameplay. And wow, I can admit the quantity of Final Fantasy games I have played isn't the highest. I think the qualities of my favorite are immeasurable. Well, I'm going to attempt to measure it. To defend a game I've heard so many engage with on a surface level, to dive deeper into the gameplay, story, tone, and themes. How does Strangers of Paradise help to define the modern era of Final Fantasy and deliver a delectable, rich experience at every turn? And more importantly, why is it my favorite?
Important disclaimer. I haven't played every Final Fantasy or even beaten all of the ones that I just mentioned and own. But I still have valid things to say about Strangers of Paradise, and I think the reasons that it is my favorite are valid. It might not always be my favorite. I think it will always hold a very special place in my heart for what it is and what it represents, and I want to talk about that. Also, I don't have autofocus. I don't know. There are a few important things to establish about the game before we dive into a review of the gameplay and presentation. As I mentioned, there are numerous entries of various forms in the Final Fantasy series. Strangers of Paradise, or SOP, is both a spin-off and spiritual remake / prequel to the original Final Fantasy, which is a contextual lens that we need to address the game through before proceeding to, like I said, the aforementioned review of the gameplay presentation and maybe eventually the story. So SOP is a spiritual remake / prequel to the first Final Fantasy game, which at the time of reveal and release garnered a mixed reception. I want to spend more time in this video praising the things I love about this game. I want to highlight why it's my favorite Final Fantasy rather than defend myself from or attack a strawman who hates the game unequivocally. However, it is important to establish that people did not have nice things to say about this game when it was revealed. And I don't just mean the memes. I think the memes are funny, and I think there's a lot of people who actually really, really love the game, participate in the meme stuff, because it is fun. And it is part of Jack's character, and we'll get to it. However, it is important to establish that people did not have a nice thing about nice things. However, it is important to establish people didn't have nice things to say about the game when it was revealed. Everything from the story, visual presentation, music, and level design was scrutinized by a larger audience even before the game was released. When I bring this game up in Twitch chats or hear it being mentioned on podcasts, it's usually not in a positive way. However, I'm far from the only one that is enamored with this game. Even a year after the DLC is complete, you can still find people playing online and streaming the game to Twitch. But people like me that love this game fucking love it. It's never too late to pick up the game and start a playthrough with some friends. For hell, the game has the least predatory DLC model of any Square Enix game I've seen in the last decade. And it would have been super easy to set up a shop where you could buy Buster swords and custom Tifa outfits for Neon. That being said, I also want to acknowledge I have not completed the DLC. I have earned the Platinum Trophy in the base game, but I've been playing the DLC with a friend, and we've kind of just been enjoying the ride. I know there's some lore and some jobs that I won't talk about just because I don't fully know about them. I also haven't played Neo and Neo 2, but it's super important to acknowledge the huge role that Team Ninja played in developing this game. Earlier this year, it was announced Square canceled several projects in favor of narrowing their scope and identity. while I think that Danger is directed more at smaller and different series like Octopath and Bravery, I'm worried about Origins as well. I want to show why I love this game for everything that it does different. Why I think Square titles embracing diversity and chaos is the best thing. Since we initially got the Final Fantasy series in the wrong order, re-releases and collections featuring games like Final Fantasy 2 and 3 became increasingly popular in the early 2000s. One of those collections being the familiarly titled Final Fantasy Origin. A collection featuring Final Fantasy 1 and 2. The fact that Strangers of Paradise shares its main title with this collection is so fitting, as Strangers of Paradise is not just a celebration of Final Fantasy 1, but the Final Fantasy series in its entirety, past and future, a collection of its own. To help inform this video, I actually purchased and began playing through Final Fantasy Origin on an original PS2 hardware. To complete the game, I didn't really dive into Final Fantasy 2 as of yet, but I did get a basic understanding from the original games, its mechanics, some of those main quests and side quests, and elements of lore and characters that carry over into the remake. I do intend to finish the game in time, but we'll also be getting a big understanding from the original game using the Final Fantasy Ultimate and a few other pieces of literature that we'll maybe talk about later. We'll get there.
I think it's fair to say that SOP is not a perfect adaptation or remake of the original Final Fantasy. There are many monsters, locations, and NPCs that are unaccounted for during Jack's adventure. I would have loved to see the witch or trolls that are two important NPCs with side quests that you meet within like the first hour of playtime in the original game. The infamous red dragon from the CGI cutscene so desperately deserved a spot as a boss, and I would have loved to see enemies like crocodiles and water nagas, rather than reusing enemies with additional moves, new AI, and new names in later levels. We will later discuss in more detail the level design of the game, and I think there is some merit to the desire to see Final Fantasy adapted into an open world. I think the original game, through its unique backgrounds and enemies, encourages exploration of the map as a means of grinding and story progression. However, I think the decision to make levels based on Final Fantasy locations, but inspired by the entire series, is more powerful and evocative. SOP has a dedication to celebrating what Final Fantasy is that bleeds through its design, gameplay, and themes, which we will discuss more later. The beautiful stages taking inspiration from locations across the Final Fantasy canon, accompanied by the wonderfully written Fool's Missives, they're given deeper context and meaning within the story. Gear, bosses, and even abilities that appear from all over the series are gathered as a celebration of Final Fantasy and a transition into the new era. While SOP is far from the first action-based Final Fantasy, coming out long after the likes of Type 0 and Dissidia, and even after more modern titles like Final Fantasy 15 and 7 Remake, I still think SOP deserves a place in the conversation around Final Fantasy's transition to a more action-focused combat, mature tone, and modern features. Giving the player the ability to play solo with AI or online with friends, featuring a more mature tone while keeping its story deeply entrenched in series lore, the strong action boss design with emphasis still placed on stats, jobs, and party building. In so many ways, Strangers of Paradise is the perfect blending of multiple eras. The game fully embraces the chaos that comes with a franchise so long running, with so many entries. Jack's theme plays in my head at least once a week, maybe every single day, and I swear to God that's not an exaggeration. When Jack's theme starts playing on the home menu because I'm hovering over the game, I just sit and listen to it for a bit. The music throughout this game is at times triumphant and orchestral, at times jazzy and smooth, at times edgy and passionate, and even electronic and groovy. It's no surprise to anyone that a Final Fantasy game features an incredible soundtrack, but the breadth and diversity of it truly speaks to the identity and thematic core of the game. The music is powerful and has the ability to transport you into a frantic field of battle or a zen state of focus. The optimism and resolve I feel from the relentless march of the percussion and the map theme, juxtaposed by the cool and calming synth lead, is continually refreshing no matter how many hours I spend creating custom builds and navigating the menus. All of the gear within those menus lovingly rendered and paying homage to the reoccurring weapons like the Ogre Killer Axe and fan favorites like the Masamune, using the wide array of stunning animations across the special, command, weapon, and enemy abilities makes for some of the most visually pleasing combat in action games. The way enemies reel back when parried by the soul shield, the specific blocking animations Jack adapts per weapon, and the distinctive defensive quickstep and roll all lend to a satisfying combat feel. It's an incredible array of animation variety, and an even more impressive when you take into account the 4 other playable party members. The only animation those party members miss out on being admittedly some of my favorites in the entire game, the Soul Burst. No matter how many times I watch Jack smash a pixie with the orb she sat on, it will always be satisfying. The aggressive scrape of the flan along the ground, the brutal impaling of the wraiths. The camera work sells the violence and desperation of these finishing attacks like no other action game finishers. The first enemy I really struggled with being the Nightmare Horse. Its erratic movements make it difficult to lock down, exacerbated by its strong AoE water spells. The satisfaction I felt the first time Jack snapped that horse's neck, I don't think it will ever be matched by any video game animation, and I play fighting games. Overall, this game nails its presentation and similarly succeeds in a blending of FF past and future. Locations from every mainline Final Fantasy are beautifully reimagined, many of them receiving gorgeous set pieces where the camera pulls back and allows you to take in the spectacle of visual design. From the beautiful crystal trees in the wetlands, the awesome spiraling crystal tower, and the sleek greenhouse rooms and elevators of Villagia Court, to the dank cavern illuminated by the Soul Cannon and the disgusting fleshy terrain of Terra Tortuga, the variety in design and direction while keeping our adventure, characters, and enemies feeling cohesive and succinct is a testament to the excellent work done on these levels, and one part of the reason I think they're far stronger than Square's recent outings in open worlds. While I believe the opinion that open world games are simply better than games crafted with a linear level structure is one that is less popular now than in the heyday of the genre innovation, the design philosophy has become increasingly commonplace recently, especially in the realm of the JRPG. In recent years, we've seen a renaissance of open-world games, from the recent Final Fantasy entries like Final Fantasy 15 and 7 Rebirth, to Zelda's past 2 mainline titles, and even Miyazaki's critically acclaimed Elden Ring. I think there's a fair case to be made for players' expectation of Strangers of Paradise to be less linear. Between so much success in blending elements from JRPGs and open-world games in recent years, and the original Final Fantasy's elements of exploration and focus on discovery through new enemy zones and side quests. However, beyond the aforementioned stellar visual presentation, I also believe the combat of Final Fantasy Origin is far better served by the phenomenal levels that have been crafted. Games like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth are able to offer stunning visual set pieces and satisfying movement in areas like Cosmo Canyon. However, fighting the smaller penguin-like Ski and lizard-like Banshee in the vast plain feels empty, unsatisfying, and easy to avoid or flee from. Areas like Gongaga can provide a wonderful and immersive sense of exploration with dynamic and engaging use of open vertical design. However, fighting the incredibly small and background-colored frogs in cramped valleys is far from ideal. You can see the consequences of the open world in the overall design of the enemies. Most of the smaller foes shoot projectiles or feature a move that spins them around the battlefield to occupy space. Most of the birds and floating enemies still feel the same with their limited dive attacks, and even the human encounters feature nothing as unique as the Rufus fight in Remake. Well, as I previously mentioned, Origins could have benefited from adapting more classical Final Fantasy monsters. The foes they have chosen, with a huge variety of moves and behaviors that change with difficulty, and the encounters are tailored to the areas you combat them in. I remember the Coriol being an extremely difficult enemy to face early on. However, once you understand its telegraph pattern of swipes, flash kicks, and absorbable thunder abilities, the enemy feels easy to approach and dismantle. The game is able to expand the enemy's usefulness and offer an engaging challenge to the player by creating scenarios where its consistent pattern featuring large AoE and tracking spells becomes harder to deal with because of the enemy's placement and grouping, like placing a single Coriol in the back of a room full of elementals who can buff each other and the cat, as well as take up space of their own with abilities and tracking spells. There's also this nightmare room, amplifying that challenge later in the same level by increasing the enemies and limiting the space, and the same area is remixed to feature even more cats during a side mission, which is another good thing to touch on. Though the levels have a defined start and end in the story, they feature several paths with small treasures and even unlockable missions. While all of these side missions take place in the original set of levels, they're able to make them feel different by giving the player a different set of goals, spawning them in a different part of the level and placing key objectives further off. I think of the Cavern of Fire, which features a side mission where you seek out tomberries to slay in the far corners of the fiery caves, or the side mission of the Gallia Court, which features an objective and enemy formation so iconic I remembered it as part of the main mission until replaying the game recently. In the Gallia Court side mission, you are tasked with killing several nightmares, a horse-style enemy with a host of powerful tracking water spells, and a frantic and powerful charge. In one of the beautiful greenhouse rooms, you'll encounter several horses and Gigasworm, an enemy with movement abilities antithetical to the horses. The worms control space in their own way, however, featuring a devastatingly strong thrashing attack and powerful unblockable. The horses and caterpillars both share a trait, a spell they use at low health to increase their challenge, the horses fortifying themselves against damage and casting in a more rapid succession after their charges, and the worms becoming engulfed by flames and rage, gaining the ability to quickly roll around the arena and do massive damage. The design of this encounter in this arena is challenging because it's specific and intentional. These enemies even perform completely different actions in lower difficulties, the horses charging less often and the caterpillars losing the ability to perform Flame Wheel entirely. It's this intention and control placed by the developer throughout the various missions, levels, and boss encounters that drives the gameplay loop. In my opinion, the other half of the loop, the loot, and more importantly, the builds are just as fun. While I've already spent my fair share of time praising the presentation of this game, it's impossible to talk about the menus without talking about their presentation. I've already mentioned the music's zen quality, however the menu's sound design is also a master in its class. Its satisfying clicks and whooshes, the player's flow state is able to persist into the management of gear, abilities, and level selection, not only because of the aesthetic design, but also the design consistency. Without getting too far into later chapters of this video, it's important to talk about how the main menu functions in and outside of a level. These menus reflect the themes of the game we will come to discuss, and it's entirely intentional, as their elements are mostly diegenic to the story taking place. Not only is the level select map and element our characters interact with, but also the save points or cubes. While the player is free to open the menu at any time during the gameplay, some menu options will be missing during level gameplay. The cubes allowing the player to access the full main menu as seen on the map screen. This consistency helps build muscle memory and positive association to the menus in the player. The navigation obviously plays a key role in the menu flow state, as well as featuring extensive quality of life features like an easy to use and extremely specific search and filter function, and an extremely viable auto equipped, and late game stat bending features that allow you to create your perfect build. While I understand how some people could find this aspect of the game tedious or unappealing, it feels to me like the ultimate adaptation of Final Fantasy's inspiration, D&D. Between gear, abilities, visual outfit, jobs, and their bonus stats, affinity bonuses, and even alignments, managing your build in Final Fantasy Origin is like creating a character sheet. The game totally embraces the player's desire to create whatever kind of build they want. Some will hone their stats with perfect damage or farming. Personally, I love creating builds inspired by classic fantasy archetypes, Dungeons and Dragons classes, and even other Final Fantasy and video game characters. One of the builds I played with for my first story run has even inspired me with an idea for a character if I ever play D&D. A white mage priest who prays to an eldritch god is cursed as a berserker. The gameplay in SOP allowing me to cast regen over time before popping the berserker state for extra damage. In D&D, it could play into the story of my character, the gameplay's aspect of luck, and the team dynamic. As a healer that could with a bad roll gain massive damage but lose the capability to heal and even turn against his allies altogether. In many ways, that character would be partially inspired by Jack and the story of Final Fantasy Origin. While its intention was not received, the game director later spoke on the intentionality behind the reveal trailer. After doing so much reflection on the game, I think I understand the focus on chaos, and I find the reveal trailer almost vulnerable in its presentation of theme, tone, and story. Opposite of chaos is control. These two elements are consistent in the presentation, gameplay, and story. To kill chaos is to take control. Jack is on a journey to create a new self. His demeanor expresses his desperate struggle for control against preconceived notions of order, masculinity, and colonization. Look. This video can be a normal game review, okay? All I have to do is talk about the story and the characters and the themes, and we can be done. I don't need to read philosophy quotes. I need to validate my thoughts on a piece of media.
Don't press that. Why are you checking the runtime of the video? Don't click that bar. You're gonna trigger a second phase. Franz Fanon writes, "Decolonization never goes unnoticed, for it focuses on and fundamentally alters being, and transforms the spectator, crushed to a non-essential state, into a privileged actor captured in a virtually grandiose fashion by the spotlight of history. It infuses a new rhythm specific to a new generation of men with a new language and new humanity. Decolonization is truly a creation of new men. But such a creation cannot be attributed to a supernatural power. The thing colonized becomes a man through the very process of liberation." The rest of that quote is actually gas. I should keep reading that paragraph. You all really need to read this book because the rest of that quote is gas. As I read through his final work, The Wretched of the Earth, I couldn't help but ponder on what liberation meant, not only literally for Franz Fanon and his experiences in places like Algeria, but also the long history of colonization in places like Japan and North America. Reading this book really helped me reflect on the themes of chaos and control. I'm not saying JRPGs or other Japanese media is unanimously helpful in understanding decolonization. Japan has its own history with fascism and imperialism, one that I should probably know more about, but US education. Listen, there's some books on my reading notes, don't worry. As we come to discuss Fanon, I hope you'll see how the Japanese have also been and are still viewed as the native. I think many JRPGs feature themes of decolonization and unlearning, and all of which support Strangers of Paradise and The Wretched of the Earth's central theme of abandoning Manichaeism.
To put it simply, rejecting the idea of good and bad. Jack, Ash, Neon, Sophia, and Jed are a huge part of what makes this my favorite Final Fantasy game. While they aren't afforded a lengthy and complicated backstory like other Final Fantasy party members, it's their charming dialogue, endearing performances, and brilliant team dynamic that make them so memorable. They are the quintessential five-man band, and their role in supporting Jack plays directly into rejecting the aforementioned Manichaeism we'll come to define after exploring the group dynamic. Jack is obviously the group leader or protagonist. The gameplay puts you in the shoes of Jack, meaning the story takes a central focus around him as a character. He leads scenes through the player's direct actions. So many key moments of dialogue happen during the level's gameplay, whether it's the group's uncanny feeling of deja vu, Jet and Jack's endearing heart-to-heart, or Ash's patient guidance. While Lancer was the role it took me the longest to place, in the end, it's obviously Ash. His stoic and thoughtful demeanor offer comfort and guidance to the group. He's seen in pivotal scenes making plans with Astos and Jack. While he's not a Vegeta or Lancer type Lancer, he does serve as the group's de facto second leader and often voice of reason. Part of the reason I think the group fits the dynamic of the five-man band so well is because their class's correlation with features and archetypes traditionally associated with the rules. The sage, Sophia, appropriately being the brains. Her realm of knowledge feels more based in observation compared to Asha's reflective wisdom. Everyone loves a bit of a sassy know-it-all, and Sophia is constantly on my nerves because she's not wrong. Similarly, I think it's easy to write off Jed as annoying early on. However, there's a depth, vulnerability, and sincerity to his goofy character that makes him an archetypical but perfect heart for this group. That just leaves Neon as our brawn. And while that may seem unconventional, I think it is intentional. Again, her gameplay as a tanky paladin or warrior supports the idea she is capable in combat. Her voice lines are often fiery and aggressive, and most importantly, she's different from the other three party members. Jack and the others are Luthenian. They've come from another land to extract resources from Neon's dimension. Neon is Cornelian, and Neon is also the host of Chaos we defeat joining our party at the start of the run. Except this isn't Jack's first run. You started the tutorial in the middle of a previous failed attempt. Neon isn't just strong because of her headstrong demeanor, but also because her presence is a differentiator. Neon's strength is change. She gives the party the ability to not only complete their mission, but forge a new path. Neon is like a warrior of light or something. I didn't get there in the DLC, but it's pretty obviously that she's like an anomaly to the cycle, even if you don't play the DLC, because yeah, it's just obvious.
We have seen, therefore, that the Manichaeism that first governed colonial society is maintained intact during the period of decolonization. In fact, the colonist never ceases to be the enemy, the antagonist, in plain words, public enemy number one. The oppressor, ensconced in his sector, creates the spiral of domination, exploitation, and looting. In the other sector, the colonized subject lies, coiled and robbed, and fuels as best he can the spiral which moves seamlessly from the shores of the colony to the palaces and docks of the metropolis. In this petrified zone, not a ripple on the surface. The palm trees sway against the clouds. The waves of sea lap against the shore. The raw materials come and go, legitimizing the colonist's presence, while more dead than alive, the colonized subject crouches forever in the same old dream. The colonist makes history. His life is an epic, an odyssey. He is invested with the very beginning. We made this land. He is the guarantor for its existence. If we leave, all will be lost, and the land will return to the Dark Ages.
Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth is a work anyone who is invested in decolonization, decentralization, or any political reform should seriously engage with. Given the Western Empire's historical and current involvement with colonialist efforts, and nationalism, it's a piece of work I think every citizen could value engaging with. Fanon writes about decolonization not as a spontaneous and violent singularity that gives power to an individual through violence, control, or self-indulgence, but a slow, informed, and resolute process of actualization, building the consciousness of a community that places the power in the hands of all its members. The value of unlearning and abandoning Manichaeism being central themes of Fanon's writing are also found in Jack's relationships with his goals, emotions, and community. As I mentioned, the story of Final Fantasy Origin begins in the middle of one of Jack's numerous excursions to the dimension. During the tutorial, we face off against one of the Four Fiends, a fight Jack will inevitably lose, forcing him back to Lufenia. Jack is basically a soldier for these people. He's sent in with an objective, but his knowledge, his relationships, his memories are all to be carefully managed, so he will see his task through to fruition with as little friction as possible. While all of these details aren't present the same way in the original game, all of the crazy dimension hopping and time travel is directly pulled from the original game and expounded upon greatly. We come to learn that the Lufenians have traveled to several dimensions, other worlds of Final Fantasy, to extract resources. The prophecy about the Warriors of Light they deliver to the world is not truly in service of the Cornelian people, but their control over the aforementioned powerful warriors. Jack is told by defeating the Four Fiends, dispelling the native protectors of their sacred temples, that he can vanquish chaos, instilling control. After following the orders of the Lufenians to a place of success, Jack spirals, losing his drive as he begins to understand his goals and ambitions came from the dreams of others and no motivations of his own. It's through the tragedy of his memory that he comes to realize he has been wielding his agency against those he cares deeply for. The final fight with Astos being the first of many tragic deaths that would force Jack to unlearn the history he'd been told and send him to that place to become chaos and grant his allies the powers of the fiends to create a new idea of being. Thanks to the love, patience, and guidance of his allies, Jack is able to build a new understanding of his world and seek to make positive change by relinquishing his power to the Cornelian people. The game uses classical Final Fantasy and even video game iconography to create powerful allegory and moments of immersion. There are small touches throughout the game, such as the map Astos uses to guide the party being the same as the map we use to navigate the level select. More prominently, the party often directly references the bonfires or save points of SOP, also known as the cubes. Thanks to the aforementioned power and consistency of the menu options accessible at the cubes, they obviously become a respite for the player, and are often acknowledged as such by the party through an array of incredibly charming lines of dialogue. For me, this acknowledgement of the gameplay aspects like potion counts and cubes by the characters in the story endears me to them even more and immerses me in their experience. Since the story of Strangers of Paradise features the group replaying these events through a time loop and interacting with a foreign dimension using alien technology, the characters often feel like they are interacting with the game world in their own right, dipping their toes into the water to accomplish their goals, resetting their runs, and storing their data on memory cards. The crystals are ever-present iconography in the Final Fantasy series, and here they function as an incredibly powerful metatextual story element, representing the memory cards one would have used to save in the original Final Fantasy, and a vehicle for our characters' memories to persist through the time resets. The crystals are able to absorb clouds of darkness that our party encounters throughout their adventure. It's heavily implied that darkness is the weight of memory and knowledge. The fiend Tiamat, who overpowers Jack in the tutorial, does so by flooding him with a great wave of darkness. As we'll come to learn, the fiends are more ally than enemy, so it makes sense that Tiamat would try to defeat Jack in this way. Following this logic also helps us understand why the stage bosses often leave clouds of darkness that force whoever absorbs them into a jarring flashback. Tiamat similarly regenerates herself entirely from nothing but darkness in her second phase, rebuilding herself from memories. Astos also wields powerful darkness attacks in the first phase of his fight, forcing Jack to recall his memories of several past runs when they clashed during the mid-phase fight. And I guess Astos recalls his true form as well. While the elements of the story that champion decolonization can be muddled through artistic direction, I ultimately think it's Jack's embracing of darkness and sharing of knowledge with Sarah and the Cornelians through the crystals that serves as a powerful representation of unlearning and consciousness building. Fanon writes about how the efforts of decolonization need to renounce manichaeistic view and create allies in their pursuit of liberation. In the metropolis, stereotyped as the wicked, bloodthirsty stepmother, numerous and sometimes prominent voices. Let me restart it. In the metropolis, stereotyped as the wicked, bloodthirsty stepmother, numerous and sometimes prominent voices take a stand, condemn unreservedly their government's policy of war, condemn unreservedly their government's policy of war, and urge that national will of the colonized finally be taken into consideration. Soldiers desert the colonized ranks. Others explicitly refuse to fight against the people's freedom, are jailed, and suffer for the sake of the people's right to independence and the management of their own affairs. While we can look to Fanon and the ideas of decolonization to help us understand the story of the Lufenians and Cornelia, I took a look into the work of another philosopher to help understand Jack's character. His edgy and violent demeanor masks a desperation he feels in search for control over his own destiny. Foucault similarly writes about a new man and theorizes one's ability to best serve their community can only manifest once they've appropriately fostered an informed sense of self. The risk of dominating others and exercising a tyrannical power over them arises precisely only when one has not taken proper care of the self and has become a slave of one's desires. But if you take proper care of yourself, that is, if you ontologically know where you are, if you know what you are capable of, if you know what it means for you to be a citizen of a city, to be a master of a household, if you know what things you should and should not fear, if you know what you can reasonably hope for, and, on the other hand, what things should not matter to you, if you know, finally, that you should not be afraid of death, if you know all this, you cannot abuse your power over others. Thus, there is no danger. This understanding of oneself ontologically mirrors Jack's journey to discover his place as chaos. Foucault is writing about ethics and the concern of the self, and what it means to take care of oneself. Keenly, he describes the necessity to be in contact with one's history and community to best serve them. Every individual has power and aspects about themselves they can wield in service of or against those around them. Jack wields his power through strength and violence. He seeks for self-actualization and control over others through violence. When absorbing the darkness, regaining these memories, and learning the true goals of the Lufenians, Jack is able to understand his place in their society and reject it. Rather than wielding violence in the name of the oppressor, Jack learns he can uplift the oppressed and help other Cornelians like Neon strike back against Lufenia in seeking their own liberation. In educating himself on the history of the conflict and finding other people he could trust and rely on for wisdom and guidance, Jack embraces the chaos of the world around him and becomes a new, better man for it. So why do I like Strangers of Paradise so much? Sure, there's some amazing Final Fantasy action games. It's a direction the series has been trending towards for some time. But the wide variety of satisfying animations combined with the actualization of D&D levels of build customization keep me coming back to try new things. The story is mature and metatextual, laying a powerful groundwork for the darker stories of Final Fantasy we see today. For me personally, the themes and character arcs feel seeped in ideas of unlearning, rejecting Manichaeism, and change. Final Fantasy Origin Strangers of Paradise is a celebration of the Final Fantasy series, and not just because of the beautifully recreated locations or vast array of reoccurring weapons and monsters, or its tone, theme, and story blending elements of fantasy, futurism, and decolonization I think are present throughout the whole franchise. Final Fantasy Origin embraces chaos and rejects control. Its most powerful weapon is change. Many of you are probably aware of the history of Final Fantasy. It was creator Sakaguchi's last attempt at making it in the games industry. His final situation, one last dream. Every Final Fantasy will have differences and similarities, but I think the underlying factor to them all is diving into change, embracing, becoming chaos. During an interview with Famitsu, Sakaguchi says, "Way back then, the spirit was that we weren't making a product, but a creation. It was putting our soul into the production, pouring all of your ideas into the game, even if they crop up during development, not saving anything for a sequel. So when you finish, you're empty. You've got no idea what to do next. But by pushing yourself forward, new things come to light." I think it's good that Spirit has continued forward with Final Fantasy.